friends.
So yesterday, this is thanks to S. Michael DeHart, who's a huge West Virginia fan, and we have a lot of Mountaineer fans that have been a part of this show really since we began back in 2020. And he gave me this story about Joe Mazzulla, who's the head coach of now the world champion Boston Celtics, and the influence that a professor on the campus at West Virginia had on his life and also his collegiate career. Dr. Carolyn Atkins joins us. She's an ambassador to the president, and it's a great story. She joins us now on 365 Sports. Dr. Atkins, I hope that's okay if I introduced you as that, because that's the kind of respect I have for what you've done. So,
well, that's fine, and Carolyn is fine too.
All right. What did you watch the Celtics win Monday night or whenever?
I did.
Okay. What were you thinking about? Here's a former student that you really helped, and he's now on top of the NBA world.
Well, I'm not sure how much I helped him win the Celtics game, but I was so proud of him. I was almost afraid. The article had come out in the paper, and I thought, oh, is this a bad omen? And I watched intently, more than I typically watch some of those games, but I was thrilled for him. And of course, as I usually do, I wanted to wait until the end when I heard him speak, because in the past, what I used to do was I would go to their press conferences to see if what we did in class was carrying over when they were being interviewed. And so I was happy with his remarks. I think he did a fabulous job, and I'm just really pleased for him and for his team.
You know, you mentioned to me, and I believe you said this to me last night when we spoke for a little bit, is that you used to hear about these athletes, and then all of a sudden you had a lot of them in your class. What you heard or read about them, was it different than what you actually experienced with what you saw?
Well, actually, it's funny that you asked that. I wrote a book, and I called it Great Unexpectations, and what you're asking really formed the basis for that. I entered that class. I started that program in 1990, and I would just take 10 or 12 athletes a semester. And in my head, I would go in and I would teach them as I taught every other student. We'd learn about public speaking and so forth. What I didn't expect from this group was what I would learn from them, what they would teach me. And it was such an eye-opener. I can remember having a class that was, the class was about an hour and 15 minutes in length. And I would give a lot of little icebreaker speeches in the beginning so that they could get to know each other. And I really look at this. It was fun whenever I had a lot of people on the same team. For example, the group that Joe was in, I think it was all 8 recruits. John Beeline put all of them into my class. And I think it was really a team building exercise because they got to know a little bit about each other off the court. And so I would give assignments like, tell me about one of the funniest things that you ever did, and then they would have to tell a story about it, or tell me about one of the most disappointing. And so we learned, with them speaking, we learned about each other, and I think that it was a very much an eye-opener. The first semester that I taught it, I was actually surprised, and I remember coming home and saying to my husband, I want everybody else to hear what I'm hearing, because I knew they weren't. And that's when I started the final presentation. So I got the Jerry West Lounge in our basketball coliseum, and I created an invitation, and I listed the students' names on them and the order in which they'd be speaking and the title of their speeches, and I sent it. And one of my favorite responses to the first one was from Coach Gail Catlett, who was our basketball coach at that time. He got the invitation and actually thought it was a joke, because he had a few players in that class. And he called me and wanted to know, is this legit? And I said, absolutely. And he said, now you're telling me that you're going to get these players to talk about these topics. And I said, that is correct. And he said, well, not only will I be there, I would pay to be there. And he came every semester to hear his athletes. And the one semester that he could not come, he sent his wife with the tape recorder so that she could record the speeches. So that was the kind of support I had from a lot of the coaches. And I think it was an eye-opener for them, too, in some cases, because these kids would finally relax. and share a little bit about themselves and their personal lives. And it was a learning experience for all of us. It was a different side that we had never seen. We were concerned with touchdowns and points and free throws. I wasn't concerned with any of that. I just wanted to get to know those athletes and listen to their stories and help them tell their stories. And I think for a lot of them it helps. And I think Joe might have been one of them, because I don't know if you had a chance to watch his speech.
I did.
His final speech, Growing Pains. But he talked about the high school Joe Mazzulla and mistakes that he'd made, which certainly is not unusual. I think any high school student can say that. College students can say that. But the bottom line was he finally learned from them. And I think that his mistakes taught him discipline. I think he was, interestingly about Joe, he was always a good student in my class. I really very rarely had classes where the students did not attend. They came to class, they did the work. If they didn't, they got the grade that they deserved. And so that class that he was in, which were the 8 recruits, that was really a great class. They came, they participated, they did everything. I would take them to Children's Hospital to visit the children, and we would have someone take us around to specific rooms. I took them to elementary schools, and they read aloud. I took them to middle schools and high schools, and they gave speeches. So I got them out in the public so that everybody could see what I was seeing, because I was proud of them. I was proud of what they were doing.
Dr. Carolyn Atkins with us at West Virginia on Joe Mazzulla, also Pat White, Deshaun Butler, among others. Did you get the feeling that all of this that the young men or athletes would then say was inside their body and they couldn't wait to actually share it, rather than some of their, maybe not demons, but things that kind of had bottled them up a little bit?
Well, I think that sometimes they didn't know how to say it.
Right.
And for example, I had a basketball player one semester who was so quiet. He didn't participate much in class. He attended, he did the work, but he didn't say much. And so I would always make appointments for them to come to my office individually, and we would work on this final speech so I could kind of draw it out of them and show them how to write it and so forth. And he came in, I'll never forget, and I'm in speech pathology and audiology at the time. That was my department. And he came in and he pointed to a book on my desk, and he said, "Oh, you have the joy of signing." And when he said that, it was about sign language. I said, "What do you know about the joy of signing?" And he said, "Well, my mother's deaf." And all of a sudden that clicked as to why he wasn't that expressive, why he wasn't that conversational. And so that one of the things that I suggested to him was, you know what, the next time we do one of these icebreaker speeches, why don't you talk about that? Why don't you tell the others in the class about that experience and how that might have changed you or affected you? And he did start to open up a little bit. But I understood him the moment he said that. So it's interesting what you can learn if you just listen. And unfortunately, in our society today, we are not very good listeners.
Not at all.
And that's a problem. That's a problem.
Former star quarterback, I mentioned Pat White. He was being inducted into the Mobile, Alabama Hall of Fame. He sent you a text, "Preparing for my speech and thought about you, Mrs. Atkins. Thank you for the loving energy you showed us knuckleheads." That had to be that had to be really, really cool. I got goosebumps reading that.
Yeah, that was great. And I had Pat White and Steve Slayton at the same time. And I'll tell you another story about that. I looked at my phone one day in the office. I had a voicemail, and I listened to it. And it was Coach Billy Stewart. And he was telling me that he was going to put Pat White and Steve Slayton in my class. And I'd forgotten about that. And then, of course, unfortunately, Coach Stu passed away. And about 3 years later, I happened upon that voicemail, and I sent it to his family and said, this is a great voice from the past. But yeah, and I had these coaches that wanted their students to do well. And Pat and Steve were great. The problem with them, when I wrote my book, I wanted to interview them in some detail, but I couldn't take them anywhere because anytime we went anywhere, they were surrounded by fans. And so we had to stay in my office and do it. Even when we went to the schools, we went to a middle school and we were going to be speaking to, I think, fifth graders. And when we walked in, it was lunchtime, and we walked into the cafeteria area. And when those kids saw those two guys, they immediately got up and gravitated to them and talked to them. And that was the type of response that they got when they went out into the public. And they were both great guys.
So you mentioned Jerry West Hall. Craig, what did you say? There was a moment where Jerry West actually wanted to help Joe Mazzulla as well.
Well, yes, and Joe, I think, had told that story about he and Johnny were good friends, and so I think he got to know Jerry obviously through Johnny. And I'm not sure what was going on, but the story goes that Jerry called Joe and really told him what he needed to do to change and be successful. And of course, Joe fortunately took it to heart, and I think that was the type of guy that Jerry West was. When I met him I met him as a child growing up in Morgantown. I had his autograph and so forth. But when I met him in 2006 and he came to campus, I introduced myself to him and I said, "I have your son Johnny in class." And he paused for a minute and he said, "Give him hell. He can take it." and and I just thought that was a great response. And then when I wrote the book, and of course I obviously wrote about Jerry West, Karen West, his wife, sent me a beautiful handwritten letter and told me that she had purchased my book for all of Jerry's sons for Christmas, and just talked about what a meaningful class it was and so forth for Johnny. And so, again, just such nice people, that are responsive and give you good feedback. And that's kind of what it's all about. That's what I tried to do with the students. I think positive feedback is important, and sometimes we don't get a lot of that in this society, whether it's in academics or the workplace.
So there was a story about actually he gave Bob Huggins advice on they should run the zone defense one year, which was pretty cool because, you could see where he was also that coach in him. And I know you haven't probably had a chance to visit with him. What would you say to him the next time either he happens to pick up the phone and call you or you see him at some event in Morgantown?
And you're talking about Joe Mazzulla now?
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
Well, what I would do is say, "Joe, just keep doing what you're doing. You're a winner." I saw it a long time ago. I see it now. He is determined. I love some of his remarks that he's made. He's cut to the chase. There's nothing artificial about Joe Mazzulla. What you see is what you get, and I like that.
Our chat room, which can be rather interesting at times because we could be talking about Willie Mays, who passed away last night, or unfortunately just a couple of weeks ago with the man you mentioned and Jerry West, but it can get into some like a turf war on just topics or whatever. And not everybody, but a lot of people are listening, which is great, to this segment, and they love what you've done and they love what you do. And it's really cool to see a lot of guys that normally the testosterone level is pretty high listening to what you've done for Joe Mazzulla, Pat White, or anyone else.
Well, it's been fun, and I'll tell you, you never know where you're going to see your athletes end up. Not too long ago, I sat down to watch a movie, and the movie was called The Burial. I don't know if you've seen that or not.
No.
And it's Tommy Lee Jones, and I sat down to watch it, and and Jamie Foxx plays in it. The very first episode, or the very beginning, Jamie Foxx is an attorney, and he's addressing a jury, and he says, "My name is Willie Gary." And when he said that, I thought, wait a minute. And I said to my husband, rewind that. And I listened to it again, and I had Charles Emanuel, who was one of the captains of our football team, and Jimmy Gary, both cousins and nephews of Jimmy Gary in class. So I had heard about Jimmy Gary from both of them in 1993 and 1996. All right. And now all of a sudden, here's this movie, and it's about Jimmy Gary, and it was what these students had talked about in class. So you never know what connection is going to be made with your athletes. And now Charles is an attorney in Orlando. I can remember when he was team captain in his senior year, and I took him to a neighboring town to speak to a school, and we were waiting to find out if we were going to a bowl. And so on the way back, it was just Charles and me. And I said to him, I said, so what do you think? Think we'll go to a bowl? And he said, oh, I know we will. He said, I'm sure. And I said, how can you be so sure? And he said, the Lord told me in a dream. Well, I'm not going to argue with that. So, okay. The next day, we have a bowl bid. And I saw Don Nealon, who was our coach, shortly after that. And I laughingly said to him, Don, I knew you were going to the bowl before you did. And he asked me how I knew that. And I told him that story. And he said, I'm not going to argue with that. So it's interesting, just some of the things that these students would come up with and tell me and then see later on, what they develop into, what they become. It's amazing. Mike Gansey was another one. Now he's general manager of the Cleveland Cavaliers. And so I just had some great students. I mean, really wonderful students that we produced.
I want to put up an image of the book. You mentioned Great Unexpectations. I'm putting the image up on our screen for people to look at it. Is that like on Amazon, or if anyone wants to read it, if anyone wants to buy the book?
Well, actually it was, but I think we just have a few copies left, and I never did anything about my husband keeps telling me to revise it and add to it, and I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it, but it went pretty quickly with the Mountaineer fans. Oh,
I bet it did. Yeah,
when it came
out. I bet it did. Well, it's a great story, and it's interesting. We don't do a lot of NBA. We do discuss, obviously, if there's an NBA Finals or stories or whatever, and obviously Boston beating Dallas, which is just around the corner from us. But S. Michael DeHart, who's a West Virginia fan, sent me the note, the link to the story that was in the, the Exponent Telegram. And I read
think
it.
So.
Yeah, and it is really, really cool. And you were great when I called you yesterday to be a part of it as well. Thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Congratulations on what you've done to impact some young men and women.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr.